Hello, everyone. Good morning. How are you doing? Good first day yesterday? I had a good time. I love playing with Legos, so that was great. Okay, so we got a ton of stuff to cover. Not a lot of time to cover it in, so this is going to be pretty blazing fast. Just giving you a heads up, you all get a copy of the slides, which has a ton of URLs, a ton of stuff, so don't feel like you have to frantically write everything down, okay? So, all right. My name is Brad Frost, as you found out yesterday. I've been working with the web on mobile devices for the past 5+ years. I've had the opportunity to contribute to a couple different books. And as I mentioned yesterday, writing a book on atomic design right now. And I also run a couple resource sites. This one's called This is Responsive, which is a collection of responsive design patterns and resources all about making great multi-device responsive web experiences. So if you want to check that out, there's a bunch of resources on there, but we're actually going to go through a lot of these patterns and stuff today. I also run a site called styleguides.io, which is all about a lot of the stuff that I covered yesterday. Pattern libraries, establishing them, tools for establishing them, resources, talks, books. We even had a podcast and stuff, so check that out. I also ran a site called Mobile Web Best Practices, which is a little bit ago now, so it's a little out of date. I also helped curate a site called WTF Mobile Web, which is what not to do when it comes to making things for all these mobile devices. So I apologize if any of your sites are on this site. It's okay. I come from the agency world. I had the opportunity to work with a lot of really big brands on a lot of different projects. And I like showing this slide, not necessarily to show off or anything, but I like showing it because nobody knows what they're doing. We think like, oh yeah, these companies that have, all this money, all these resources and stuff, like surely they have this stuff figured out. Nope. We're all feeling our way around in the dark. We're all trying to make this work. So for me, that's actually sort of a comforting thought, where it's like, oh, okay, like we're all in the same boat. Nobody really knows what they're doing, and that's fine, and that's okay. Okay. So we probably don't have time to go around and sort of individually introduce each other in ourselves and what we're up to. But raise your hand if you would call yourself a back-end developer. So you're, working with, like, you could install Joomla and you could write PHP or Node or ASP or whatever sort of back-end. Okay. What about front-end developers? Like HTML, CSS, JavaScript, that's what you're doing for your job? Okay. What about sort of like designers? Like you're responsible for the aesthetic look and feel of, okay, so like a few. And then like UX designers, like someone who's responsible for sort of wireframes and flows and sort of solving problems and stuff. Okay. Anybody manage, like project managers, or even if who's like managing other teammates? Okay. That's quite a few of you. All right, cool. Content strategy people, maybe? Okay, yeah, good, all right, excellent. Did I miss anyone? Anybody like a farmer or electrician or I don't know, musician? Okay, cool. That helps give me an idea of sort of who's in the room. I'm going to talk about things mostly from like a general UX design sort of front-end slant, so I'm not going to get like too crazy technical. It's mostly going to be sort of like overviews of a lot of different patterns and stuff. So here's the thing. I flew all the way over. It's not exactly a short flight. What do you want to know? I'm here. Anybody have any burning questions about responsive design, things that they're struggling with at work, things that they want to make sure that by the end of the session we cover this topic? Does anybody have any sort of? Yes? Yes. Yes. Yes, responsive menus and navigation on desktop screens is super easy to just display everything in this nice horizontal list, but what happens whenever we lose all that screen real estate? Thankfully, that's a favorite topic of mine, so we're going to spend a lot of time covering different responsive navigation patterns for sure. So awesome. Yeah, I got plenty for you. Anybody else? Yes? Yeah. Right. So yeah, what right, right. What breakpoints do we choose in our designs? What determines those breakpoints and all of that? Yeah, I'll totally cover that for sure. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Responsive images. Super easy topic. Just kidding. Like it's like one of the hardest things, and thankfully, actually, the dust is starting to settle, and the community's actually come up with some great solutions, and I'll talk about those for sure. Yep. Oh, okay. Yeah. 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 Yeah, absolutely. So, okay, so a couple questions. So one is like responsive embeds and how do we make those work responsively? What was the one right before that? Oh, background images. Yep, yep. We'll talk about that. And then what? Oh, M's versus REMs versus pixels. I won't cover that. I'll be using M's in all of my examples as far as breakpoints go. Long story short, I don't really use pixels ever anymore unless I'm making a one pixel border around something. So M's are basically like relative unit font sizes or sizes, period. That's based on the sort of font size of the container. Rem units are the root M unit, so it's all based off of like what the document's body is. So if you do one rem, that's equal to 16 pixels because most browsers, that's what the default is. So basically, it's always, if you do one rem, that's essentially 16 pixels. If you do one M on an element, and you set that element's font size to like 80%, it's going to be 80% of 16 pixels, right? So sort of like, yeah. But again, generally speaking, good best practice is to try to be using relative units, percentages, M's, REMs, rather than pixels anymore. Especially, and a lot of this is due to the fact that the DPI of screens are very different, especially across different Android devices. We obviously have like Retina screens, but we also have very cheap and affordable Android devices that don't have very high pixel density displays. So it's basically like anymore, a pixel isn't a pixel, which is why we want to lean harder on those relative units, because they sort of sort themselves out better on all of these different screens. Yep. Who else? Yes. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Yeah. So basically, as I'm unpacking your question, it's a little bit more like, yeah, responsive design is just sort of taking an existing site and just sort of making it squishy, right? And that's all it is. And sort of technically, you're totally correct. What you'll find out, and a lot of the stuff that we're going to cover today, touches on more of like how do we not just create these like squishy layouts, which is actually quite easy to be honest, but the real hard problems are, yeah, how do we create an experience that whenever you're on a 2G connection on a tiny phone, how do you get an optimal experience, but then also sort of serve the same general code base to the latest, greatest version of Chrome that's wired into a fiber optic network, right? So how do we sort of progressively enhance our experiences so that we're delivering the best experience based on the scenario at hand? And that's what we're going to cover a lot today, for sure. So I hope to sort of rephrase what responsive design really means. Responsive design in general, or by default, Ethan Marcotte was the one who defined responsive design. And really, responsive design 101 is just fluid grids, right? So we have these sort of grids, and we've been using them for a while, and now we're just sort of making them fluid. We have flexible images, so the media, the images, the YouTube videos inside of these grids now need to be flexible. And then the third ingredient is media queries, which we'll talk about, that allows us to conditionally apply styles whenever only certain conditions are true. So technically, again, that's all you need to do in order to make responsive websites. But that's not all that goes into making good web experiences in 2015. So we're going to talk about sort of taking it further. So far as I see it, responsive design has sort of grown out or evolved out of its original definition that Ethan defined. And now it's sort of the umbrella term that encapsulates everything that goes into making this great sort of adaptive web experience. So adapting itself to the features, the capabilities of the browser and the device and the people, right, that are using it. Anyone else? Yes? Okay. Okay, how do we prepare for 1 billion Microsoft devices, assuming that Edge is going to be the new Chrome? That's a pretty bold assumption right there. That being said, I mean, I'm totally happy that Microsoft, so in case you don't know, Internet Explorer has sort of been like the favorite sort of butt of the joke for the last, I don't know, decade or so. It's been really hard to design and develop for Internet Explorer. It's very quirky, very, very weird. But now they came out with this new browser called Edge, which very much like Chrome, just sort of is an evergreen browser, which means it automatically updates itself, follows web standards, all that good stuff. The long story short, though, is we shouldn't have to care too much about any one company, any one device, any one technology, really. A big principle of good, solid, responsive design practice is practicing what's known as just being device agnostic. It's like, if Microsoft wants to roll out a latest, greatest browser, or if Mozilla does something crazy, if Chrome and other people and Apple like keep innovating and doing stuff, who cares? Who cares? Obviously, it's our jobs to make our stuff work on all of these environments, for all these companies, for all these devices, for all these browsers. But at the end of the day, the further you sort of take a step back from any one specific technology, any one specific, like, oh, I need to make this optimized for the iPhone, and just focus on making just a solid user experience, a solid code base, solid everything, that's going to adapt itself to not just present devices in the present landscape, but also whatever comes down in the future, right? I won't show it today, but I have this slide. I talked about our redesign of TechCrunch yesterday. Whenever we made that site, this was before smartwatches and the Apple Watch and Android Wear and all that stuff happened. Whenever these watches start getting released, this guy made a browser for the Android Wear watches, and in his demo, he showed a tweet popping up on his watch that had a link to TechCrunch. He clicked on it, it opened the browser, and there is the design that I made back in 2012. And whenever I was coding that website, I wasn't like, I'm making the site work on watches, right? They didn't exist at the time, right? So the more agnostic you are whenever it comes to creating your designs, your breakpoints, your everything, right, the more future-friendly your sites are going to be. Make sense? Yeah, and hopefully, we'll talk more about that. Any more? Maybe one more? Okay, all right, cool, excellent. I keep this like pretty casual, pretty conversational, so if you have questions, if you want to, if you need clarification on something, again, I fully recognize that, I'm a fast-talking English language speaker or whatever, but we got a lot of information I'm going to plow through. So again, if you need me to clarify something, or if you have a question, definitely don't be afraid to raise your hand or just shout it out. Cool? All right, so what we're going to do for the next couple hours is really just plow through anything you could put onto a website, right? Again, navigation, images, accordions, tabs, forms, whatever. And we're going to talk about how to make those work effectively in a responsive design environment. Cool? So we'll start with layout. And the reason why we start with layout is because it's the most affected thing by the core tenets of responsive design. Again, fluid grids, flexible media, and media queries. So we'll start by talking about media queries. And by now, responsive design is 5 years old, but it's worth talking about at least what media queries are. So this is an example of just a basic layout. And by default, right, we sort of have two divs with some content in them. By default, they're sort of stacked on top of each other. And with the power of media queries, what we're able to do is say, okay, if the screen is at least this big, go ahead and put these divs side by side, right? Go ahead and put these two pieces of content side by side. And what that looks like is something like this, right, in this orange, where you basically say media all, so all media types, and if the viewport is at least 50 ems wide, which sort of translates back to your question about ems versus pixels, 50 ems times 16 pixels equals 800 pixels. So if the screen is at least 800 pixels wide, do this stuff, right? And this is tremendously powerful, right? So there's a few best practices around media queries. So first is we want to treat layout as an enhancement. This whole notion of sort of mobile-first design and development, what we're trying to do is get away from, right, we have this big desktop site. Let's figure out how to cram all that crap down onto these small screens, right? Mobile-first design and development means let's start with the constraints of mobile, right? Let's start assuming small screen first. Let's start assuming they're on a crappy connection. Let's start assuming that they don't have a mouse and keyboard, that they're using touch, right? Let's assume less, right? And solve your user problems, your business problems, your content problems on that most constrained environment first. And then as screen space becomes available, let's use layout to enhance that experience. So, for those of you familiar with CSS, this is an example of what you could do, right? So we might have a column, right? So a couple divs with a class of column, and we're giving them a width of 50%. So they're just going to sort of sit side by side, each occupying 50% of the screen, yeah? And then what we're saying here is we're saying if the screen is less than 50 ems, if the screen is less than 800 pixels, so you start getting into like tablet-sized screens and mobile screens, what we're going to do is we're going to say float none and width auto, right? So what we're doing is essentially taking them so that they don't sit side by side and instead are just sort of stacked on top of each other. Here's another way we could do that. And so what we're doing here is we're sort of flipping this on its head, where we're saying instead of if the screen is less than 800 pixels, what we're instead doing is saying, okay, I'm going to assume the screen is small by default, and only when the screen is 50 ems wide, right, is 800 pixels or above, then I want to float this thing to the left and put these things side by side. I'm just going to sort of toggle back and forth between these two approaches. You notice anything? Less code, yeah. And less code, simpler code, more maintainable code, more legible code, right? These both accomplish the same thing. But if you think about it, right, by default, right, things aren't floated to the left. By default, things aren't set to width 50%. So what we're doing is only writing these rules when we have to, right? So we're treating layout as an enhancement. And the big thing with this, not only does it result in less code, it also provides a lot better support for more devices. And especially, I'd say, like in this part of the world, for sure, this matters a great deal. Old Nokia phones, Blackberries, older Windows phone devices, even some older Androids and stuff, don't support media queries. So if you're creating desktop layouts first and then writing media queries to make mobile layouts, then unfortunately those older devices that don't support media queries will get those desktop layouts, right? So by flipping things around, we're creating a better experience for more people, right? And again, in a lot of parts of the world, including here actually, you know, this is a big deal, right? We're taking the time by sort of creating these mobile-first experience. We're creating the opportunity to sort of serve those people that are maybe using a device that's 6, 7 years old or whatever that isn't on the latest, greatest version of Chrome, right? So mobile-first CSS, better support for more devices and people, right? Simpler, smaller, more maintainable. Make sense? Do that. Okay. So here's back to your question earlier about sort of what breakpoints do we use in our designs. And I sort of talked about this yesterday, where it was like we have sort of popular device widths, so 320 pixels is an iPhone in portrait mode, 480 pixels was an iPhone in landscape mode. And this is sort of an issue. And again, coming back to creating these very device-agnostic layouts, right? By doing that, we're able to create a layout that looks and functions great anywhere, on any viewport. It doesn't matter if Apple decides to triple the size of its iPad, right? It just doesn't matter. We're just creating these agnostic layouts. And I'll just sort of show you an example of what I mean by that. If you pay attention to the TechCrunch header that we made, you're going to see we actually have quite a few breakpoints in here. So this is one instance, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So 8 different breakpoints just for the header, which is sort of crazy, right? But at the same time, what we're doing is we're adding those breakpoints, right, whenever the content necessitates it, right? Whenever images start looking too stretched or squished, whenever line lengths start looking too long and illegible, right, that's whenever we want to insert a breakpoint. My friend Stephen Hay has a great line. He says, okay, so where do we determine our breakpoints? Well, again, start with a small screen first, mobile first, expand the browser slowly until things start looking like shit. That's when you add your breakpoint, right? Whenever your design starts falling apart, right? Whenever your images and your text and your content just starts looking weird, that's when you insert your breakpoints, right? And by doing it that way, again, you're creating these layouts that are going to work and look great, no matter if it's on, you know, a big Android Note or whatever, or the new iPhone 6 Plus, or also, you know, a smaller screen or whatever, right? So we sort of take it away from having to worry about what the popular device dimensions of the day are, and instead just sort of focus on using our content as the determinant of when we insert our breakpoints. Does that sort of make sense? Okay, all right, great. Use major and minor breakpoints. So there's sort of 2 different flavors of media queries, of breakpoints. What I mean by this is you're going to have breakpoints that apply to your overarching layout. Those are what are known as major breakpoints. For example, you might have like a 3-column layout, right? So you have like a main body sort of area where, let's say it's like an article, and then you might have a sidebar in another sort of column with some stuff in it, right? And in your breakpoints, you're going to have things that say, okay, on small screens is going to be sort of one column, and on medium screens you might be able to pull one of those sidebars up beside, and then eventually you're going to get 3 columns, right? So those are major breakpoints. Whenever those happen, the entire layout changes. The entire, all the stuff inside of them, everything gets affected. That's why they're called major breakpoints. But minor breakpoints are like what I just showed with that TechCrunch example, right? Those breakpoints in the header of the TechCrunch site only apply to that specific component, right? Only the header, right? So what we're able to do is sort of, say like for our sliders and for our accordions and stuff, they're all going to have different breakpoint considerations. And this is something I've seen quite a bit, actually, wherever people say, oh, okay, well, we just need the small screen version or the mobile version, right? One, and then there's sort of like a tablet version and then a desktop version. And like they try to fit everything into those 3 buckets, right? So it's basically like 3 breakpoints for the whole design. And that's just not good. Don't do that. Instead, again, sort of write the breakpoints where your content needs them. Sometimes, some components might need, like the TechCrunch header, 8 different breakpoints. Other ones might just need 1. Other components might need none at all, right? So it's okay to write different breakpoints for different components. Does that sort of make sense? Okay. And then lastly, don't overdo it. For a while there, it seemed like everybody was trying to like out-media query each other and like have like a responsive design race. It doesn't need to be like that. Okay, so there's a few different layout patterns. My friend Luke Wroblewski wrote a really great post that sort of rounded up a lot of different common layout patterns. I'm not going to go over all of them, but I will go over a few important ones. The first is this notion of the off-canvas pattern. And we see this a lot. So a lot of responsive design is focused on sort of, okay, we have some sidebars, we're just going to stack them underneath each other. But there are other ways we could handle this, right? This notion of sort of off-canvas design is sort of taking those sidebars, and instead of stacking them underneath the main content, we're sort of pushing them off to the side, right? We see this a lot with navigation and menus and stuff like that. But what this does is this keeps the focus on the core content and leaves those sort of sidebars sort of one tap away, right? Okay, another thing is this notion, what's known as content choreography. And what content choreography is basically sometimes we want the ability to sort of fold content inside of each other. And as you sort of, the people that sort of write layout code and stuff for websites know, source order is a thing, right? So here we have like a basic 2-column layout, right? Let's say it's a blog, and you have the articles on the left and the ads on the right. By default, right, whenever we sort of shrink the browser, right, those ads that are in the sidebar are going to sort of stack underneath the main content, right? But what we might want to do is sort of fold those ads in, sort of like intersperse them in between the different articles, right? Which obviously sort of leads to sort of like a better flow and probably make the advertisers happy and stuff like that. Up until recently, though, this wasn't exactly possible using, at least like using CSS. But thankfully, thanks to Flexbox, we now have the opportunity to sort of shift things around dynamically in the source order using CSS, which is great. So pay attention to this, this sort of layout, and it's numbered. Pay attention to the number 2 slot. So whenever we shrink the browser, eventually that number 2 slot suddenly jumps to the number 5 slot, right? Which is tremendously, tremendously powerful, right? So this gives us the opportunity to sort of change things around in the source order so that we could create more optimal layouts for small screens, medium screens, large screens, extra large screens, and all that good stuff. So that's cool. And there's also a way to do this in JavaScript. This is Append Around by the Filament Group, Scott Gell. Basically, this accomplishes the same thing, only it's using a bit of JavaScript to say, okay, at this particular breakpoint, I want this to appear in this spot, and this breakpoint, I want it to appear in this spot. So there's a few different ways to sort of shift content around in source order. Okay, so that's layout. So again, we want to ensure that content flows in a logical progression. That's the sort of name of this game, right? We want to make sure that everything sort of reads nice and legibly, even in like a linear layout. Again, it's not just about sort of blindly stacking content on top of each other, right? We want to treat layout as an enhancement. Again, start with that small screen first, right? Start with that mobile first mindset. Don't go overboard. And then the other thing is that we want to watch out for page height and scrolling. And what I mean by that is that we scroll a few different, there's like a couple different scrolling sort of behaviors that people do on mobile, right? So sometimes we're just scrolling through a Twitter feed, and as we scroll, the posts are getting older, right? Or we're diving into a single article to read it, or we're going through a group of stuff like a Spotify playlist or your iTunes playlist or your contacts in your phone, right? But the problem is with responsive design, whenever, again, we're sort of taking on that like sort of desktop-first mindset, it's like, oh, let's just take all of these sidebars and just sort of stack them underneath each other, right? Let's just create this one long sort of tunnel of content. I'll just sort of show you an example. On the left, this is a demo I did for Google for their HTML5 Rocks website. I wrote a demo and article about responsive design. I'll talk about that in a bit. But you could see this is, even on a, like sort of a small screen, it's nice and sort of compact, right? It's not very long. It's not very lengthy. But on the right is President Obama's campaign website in 2012. This was the first version of it. This was a really high-profile responsive design. Everybody was like, wow, the president has a responsive design. Like, this is a big deal, right? And so it was technically true. And sort of back to your question about, like, yeah, it's great. We have, we can create these flexible layouts, but just, this is technically responsive, but let's go through why that might not be the most effective thing. So you can see we have a header, there's a donate button, there's a sort of weird Obama, Clooney, and you sort of call out, and a little newsletter sign up sort of thing. Then we have these touts, and it says it's record and brief, and let's start scrolling, and then we go through the very latest, and here's an article, and there's some social buttons, and some block quotes, another article, more images, some more images, some more images, some more images. Here's another headline, more social buttons, a block quote. Here's another headline, more social buttons. 2012 stories, here's some more social buttons. Here's another headline. Here's some bullet points coming up here. See more, take action, watch the video, local events, spread the word. Here's our Twitter feed, choose your state. And then you finally get down to the footer menu. Holy shit, right? I don't think that's a very good user experience, right? I especially like how it says take action, and it's like 7 kilometers down the page, right? So this is what we're talking about, and I think that this sort of like nails on exactly what your question was. It's like, yeah, all this responsive design stuff is all well and good, but if we're ending up with these experiences that are just like these gigantically long pages, that's not exactly a good user experience, right? So how could we address this, right? How could we make sure that we're not sending all this stuff down, especially to small screen users that are more likely to be on sort of a paid data plan and stuff like that, right? So we have a balance to strike, because on one hand, it's our responsibility to make sure that our entire experiences, all of our content, all of our functionality is available to all users, irrespective of what device, what browser, what setup they happen to have, right? This is the universal nature of the web, right? It's our ability to make things that just go anywhere and reach people whatever technology they happen to be using. That is tremendously powerful stuff. But at the same time, right, just because we now are responsible for sending more stuff to more people, right? Doesn't necessarily mean we need to send all that stuff and burden our users with a bunch of extra downloads and stuff like that. So this is a technique called conditional loading, which is just tremendously powerful and gives us the opportunity to create experiences that sort of give us the best of both worlds, right? We're able to simultaneously give people what they want, give people full functionality, but do so in a more responsible manner. So just a quick stat. A guy named Guy Pajerny ran some numbers on some of the most popular, I want to say it was even like the top 10,000 responsive websites. And what he found is that 72% of responsive websites send the same stuff down to small screens as they do to large screens, right? This wouldn't be a problem if the large screen version of the site was really fast and lightweight, but that's not the case, unfortunately. Right? The average web page is now 2.2 megs, which is depressing, which means that all these small screen users, again, people that are more likely to be on a data plan, more likely to be on a 3G or 2G network, right, are getting these desktop-size assets, right? These big hero images, a bunch of scripts that only make sense for large screen users and stuff. So how do we solve this? So conditional loading gives us the opportunity to solve this. This is a web page. And a web page consists of the thing and a bunch of things that aren't the thing. Follow me on this, all right? So, quick example. If I were to share a link on your Facebook page that says, hey, check out these pictures of cute kittens. You click the link. What do you expect to find? Kittens, exactly, right? The pictures of the cute kittens are the thing, right? If you don't see the pictures of cute kittens, you're going to be disappointed, right? That is the thing. And every web page, every single web page has a thing, right? The core reason for that URL ever existing, right? So that is the primary content on the page that needs to be prioritized. But there's a bunch of things also on the page that aren't the thing, that are also really important to the user experience or might solve some business goals. For example, pictures of cute kittens, ads, right? Of course, right? Ads to keep the lights on, to pay the hosting, to make money or whatever. Obviously a pretty important business requirement, right? But maybe share this pictures of cute kittens. Related pictures of cute kittens. Comment on these pictures of cute kittens. You get the idea. These are all sort of added things, right? Things that actually enhance the experience or, again, solve a business goal, but aren't the core content themselves. So what we can do in order to make a better user experience that gives people the thing they want sooner is to sort of defer loading those other things and sort of being more responsible about sort of pulling these things in, right? So what we could do is sort of chunk out all those related bits and pieces and just link to them from the main sort of page. This is an example, again, of the site I did for Google. This is sort of like a hypothetical product detail page of an e-commerce site. You can see it's not the best example of responsive design in the world, but at the same time, it's not the worst either. So what I'm doing here, by default, on a product detail page for an e-commerce site, what is the thing? Right? The product, exactly. The ability to view the product and the ability to buy the product, right? It's like e-commerce 101. If you're not showing the product and selling it, you're sort of not doing your job. So that is the thing. But there's a bunch of things that are also a part of the user experience that might be really good either from a business standpoint or from a user standpoint, right? Things like related t-shirts, related products, right? This is good for the business. We want to sort of also expose, hey, we also have these things for sale, and maybe somebody will be likely to put that in their cart in addition to this product, right? But then also reviews. Reviews are tremendously helpful, really, really important for making purchasing decisions, right? Lots of people, including myself, I'll go on Amazon and I'll look for the thing that has like 500 five-star reviews, and I'm like, okay, I'm buying that, right? Like it's a tremendously important part of the purchasing process, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we need to load in all of these reviews into the DOM at the very beginning. So what I'm doing here is sort of chunking these things out into their own little sort of HTML fragments, and then just simply linking to them. So these by default are just little links, right? And if I click on reviews, and I'm on a 12-year-old BlackBerry that barely could support JavaScript at all, right? I go to a new page, and I can read the reviews. Perfectly accessible, right? But then if I'm on, your modern smartphone, iPhone, Android, whatever, that has decent, good JavaScript support for the most part, whenever I click that link, whenever I tap that link, I could go and make an AJAX call, right? And then sort of dynamically pull that piece of content in and display it as like a little accordion kind of thing, right? That keeps the user in their place. They don't have to leave the page, right? Better user experience, right? And again, and I'll stress, and we'll talk about images in a bit, but if you look at this as image, 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 right? If all of those things were in the DOM by default, that's adding an easily extra 100K to the experience, maybe a meg. It depends on like how optimized those images are, right? And again, those are things that not necessarily everybody needs to see or wants to see, right? They want the product. That we want to sell the product faster, right? And so here's the thing. So we have this experience. This is our small screen experience. And then what we could do is I'll just sort of show this again, where once we hit a certain breakpoint, once the screen is large enough to accommodate that extra stuff, we're saying, okay, there's enough room here. We could go ahead and make those AJAX calls and sort of dynamically pump in those related products and those reviews, right? So this is really, really powerful, because this gives us the opportunity to sort of still serve up this fully featured user experience, but not sort of burden the initial page load with all that extra stuff. The Boston Globe, which is one of the first high-profile responsive designs to come out, they did something similar. In the top left corner of their website, they have this little weather widget. The weather widget shows the current temperature, and by default, it just simply links through to the weather section of the site, right? But if you're on a capable enough device, whenever you interact with that thing, it sort of pulls down this nice, like, sort of 5-day forecast, right? I'll just sort of show, right? You tap on that, and it shows you this nice little enhanced, like, here's what the next 5 days looks like. Pretty cool, right? And keeps the user in their place or whatever. But the big thing here, again, much like that last example I showed, that little weather widget isn't in the DOM by default. It's not loaded by default, because not everyone is going to interact with that little thing. So we're sort of loading that functionality, loading that bit of UI, loading that script, that style on demand, right? And as a result, it leads to a lighter initial experience, but still provides that richness, right? So this is, I think, one of the most tremendously powerful tools we have in our toolkit. This gives us the opportunity to create these really complex, really rich experiences, but introduce that richness, introduce that complexity in a really responsible manner. And one of the biggest sort of considerations for this is that it's okay for different users to get a different user experience, right? If small screen users have to click a button that says load comments, that's okay, right? That's all right. It's okay to, and this is sort of something I've struggled with clients, where it's like, no, not, the entire user experience doesn't need to be exactly the same across the board. So long as everybody's able to get access to the content, then that's what really matters, right? Screen size is just one variable. There's tons of different stuff that we could detect. If you're familiar with Modernizer, it's a great tool that allows you to detect for the presence of certain features. So we could say, if geolocation is supported, then go ahead and load in this little use my current location button, right, to an experience. If touch is available, then load in this swipe script so that we're able to sort of swipe through a photo gallery or something like that, right? Also, we're stating that I showed that I'm loading this extra stuff whenever you get to a certain breakpoint size. And the problem is that just because you're on a large screen doesn't necessarily mean you're on a fast connection, right? And this is a problem, right? Because sometimes you're tethering through your phone, so you're still paying for that data, right? Sometimes you're on crappy hotel or coffee shop Wi-Fi or whatever, and I'm sure that, lots of people find themselves in situations where, you're on a powerful machine, right? You're on your laptop, but you're not on a fast connection, right? So maybe you don't want all that extra stuff. The unfortunate reality is that it's sort of impossible to detect network connection. There's a few different sort of things out there. There's like a navigation like network sort of API in JavaScript that you could sort of hit, but it's not exactly robust. I don't want to say it was even abandoned. There's a little library called Boomerang that sends a little pixel out and then brings it back and sort of keeps doing that and measures how long it takes. But the unfortunate thing with that is that it really burns your battery to the ground. So this is a challenge, right? And the only real solution to this problem is to just make sure that your web pages are fast regardless of your screen size, regardless of your environment, right? So optimize images, don't include a bunch of extra bloat, right? Just constantly be optimizing for performance. Also be mindful of number of HTTP requests. Also look into the server. I won't really cover that. But what I will touch on here, and I don't usually cover this, but if you're not familiar with this little tool, this is like your best friend. This is called webpagetest.org. And you could slap in your URL into that little field, hit the go button, and in fact, you could actually add your competitor websites as well, and you could have them race, which is freaking awesome. And so this shows you, and you could select different sort of connection types and different locations and stuff, and this will show how well of a job you're doing at sort of delivering a good user experience by showing stuff on the page, right? And this is really, 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 really powerful because you're able to say, okay, it's taking us, 6 seconds to load our site, right? And our competitors are coming in at 4 seconds, right? You could show this to the CEO of whatever your client is or whatever your company is, and they'd be like, yes, we need to beat them. We need to kill them. Right? This is, they even have like little video exports, so you could sort of see, this page loaded in first. This is beating, right? LA Times is beating the New York Times. And a rough sort of thing, again, I won't get into the details about this, but you could ask me about it later. There's this notion of what's called a performance budget. It basically set out like some constraints around how big your website can be. You could say, okay, in order for us to beat our competition, we need to come in at, this page can't weigh more than 250K, right? Or this page needs to load in 4 seconds or less over a 3G connection, right? And this has a big impact on sales, on conversions, on whatever it is you're measuring. And it ends up being like about a 20% difference that users start noticing. So whatever your competitors are coming in at, you want to be at least 20% under that. And that's like a good rule of thumb for determining performance. And this is a great way to get even, again, CEOs, non-developer people to care about performance. Okay. Any questions so far? How are you guys doing? You good? Everybody all right? Yes? Okay. All right. Great. Excellent. Good. Mm-hmm. Yeah, orientation. Portrait versus landscape, things like that. thanks for pointing that out, actually, because there's media queries don't just allow you to detect width. You could also detect height. You could also detect orientation. You could say, if the viewport is in landscape mode or portrait mode, do these things, apply these rules. In my experience, just focusing on sort of width and height allow me to sort of do some stuff. It's called like vertical media queries, so paying attention to how tall the screen is. So for example, if you're making a publication, you might have your font size be sort of smaller for small screens, right? But let's say the user's on a sort of a taller screen. Maybe you could bump up the font size to take advantage of that extra space. So that and like sort of orientation gives us more dimensions to play with to really craft a good design on any screen size. So yeah, thanks for bringing that up. Anybody else? Yes. Yes. Yeah, so how do we arrange our breakpoints, minor and major? The way a lot of people will sort of structure their style sheets, I don't want to say, it's certainly not required to do this, but I'd say that like if you take a look at a lot of sort of CSS frameworks and other things, they sort of get chunked out into partials, into things like you would have like a layout SAS file that handles all of your sort of like grid system and whatever. But then you'd also have like a header SAS file, right? And so what I'd say is your major breakpoints you'd be defining in your sort of layout area where you're defining your grid system and all that. That's where those major breakpoints would go. But then the individual minor breakpoints would go right along with the header and the footer and the accordions and the tabs. You just sort of bake those media queries in to those individual sections. Yep. I can show you an example afterwards or something. Cool? Okay. Great. Again, everyone's doing okay? I want to make sure you're okay. Yeah. Yes. A quick one is this website called Solved by Flexbox, which is like, it just shows things that we've historically had a hard time accomplishing in like traditional CSS. And it's like, here's like how to do the Holy Grail layout. Here's how you vertically center things. Here's how you do a nice sort of grid system in Flexbox and stuff. And it goes through and shows the code and all that. And Solved by Flexbox. Yep. I definitely recommend checking that out. But yeah, and we could talk more about sort of the specifics of that later. Yep. Okay. Yes? I'm sorry? Oh yeah, critical CSS. Yes. Okay, so a bit of a tangent, but definitely related. I'll just sort of come back here. All right, so there's another good performance best practice is what's called critical CSS. And basically, what you're seeing here, so we're sort of racing these different voice over IP websites against each other. And you'll see that Skype is coming in at like 1 second, right? The way that they're doing this, I'm going to assume just because 1 second is actually pretty great. You have 16K. Your initial download, whenever a user requests a website, so they type it in, hit the enter button, goes out, fetches the website, brings it back. That initial HTML page can contain 16K worth of stuff. The browser will pay attention to 16 kilobytes worth of data. And so what Skype is doing is taking their above-the-fold CSS, the styles that are responsible for rendering their header and that sort of hero area, and are baking that into the initial HTML document, right? So that means the very first request that comes down the pipes, those styles are present which means that the browser can start painting that. The browser can start rendering that. And again, this means that the users see the site much, much, much faster, right? And then it'll go out and it'll fetch the rest of the styles, right? The rest of the sort of, style.css or whatever it is. And then once that gets loaded, then the browser will, render those styles as well. But the big thing is that, so CSS is what's called a blocking resource, meaning that the browser won't start loading other stuff, images, JavaScript, other stuff, other resources, until that style sheet has finished loading, right? And this becomes this really big bottleneck, because if your CSS is huge and massive and stuff like that, the browser's just going to hang and hang out until it's fully loaded. So critical CSS allows us to get the most important above-the-fold styles on the page immediately, and then sort of like lazy load in the rest of the styles. Does that make sense? Yeah. And there's some cool tools that could sort of help you accomplish this. If you do a Google search for critical CSS, you'll see some cool articles and stuff like that. But yeah, it's a great technique and is really wonderful to sort of make performance more a priority. Okay, touch. This is an issue. We are now navigating the web with our big fat sausage fingers. No longer are we using these precise mouse and keyboard sort of interactions. We now have these big, clumsy, fat fingers. And this very much impacts how we go about designing and developing our websites, right? And it used to be, we'd say, oh, okay, you're on a small screen, so we're going to blow out the padding a little bit. The best practice is your touch target should be at least 44 pixels by 44 pixels big. And so it's like, okay, we want our thumbs and our fingers to be able to tap this stuff easily, which makes sense, right? And then we say, oh, okay, you're on sort of a medium-sized screen. Well, you might be on like an iPad or something. So we're going to keep these buttons nice and big and chunky, and we're going to sort of make everything nice and touch-friendly. And then we go, oh, okay, you're on a desktop-sized screen. Therefore, you're on a mouse and keyboard display, right? And so we're going to squish everything together and make everything really tiny and clumped together, and so that a mouse can do it, right? But now we have these goofy things. Has anybody played around with like a touch screen, like laptop display a little bit? No? Okay, well, they're crazy, and they're coming. Microsoft basically has them in, Windows 10. I want to say it was even earlier than that, but yeah, all like Windows 10 devices more or less are touch supported. So we basically have millions and millions of laptops being sold right now that are touch. The actual glass of the laptop is touch friendly. Do you have one? Yeah? Okay, there we go. Perfect. So yeah, so these have real ramifications on how we go about doing our jobs, right? I got my dad there's a Chromebook Pixel, right? So it runs like Chrome, like the Chrome OS operating system, but it has a touchscreen display. And I was home visiting, and I watched how he used it. And he had a mouse hooked up to it, and then of course the laptop has a little touchpad, and it has a keyboard, but then it also has the touch screen. And I sort of just sat back and just watched him use it. And he sort of started on the mouse, sort of moved over, and started using the screen, and then back to the mouse, and the keyboard, and touch. And just I watched him for like 2 minutes, and suddenly I realized, I was like, oh shit, right? The designer in my brain went off, I was like, oh shit, right? All this notion of like, there's such a thing as a primary input type, right? Like, oh, you're on mouse and keyboard, or oh, you're on touch, is just gone. It no longer exists. That line no longer exists. And this is especially true even if you're on like an iPad or you're on your smartphone and you have like an external keyboard hooked up to it or whatever, right? We can no longer rely on this separation, which means we have to do this, right? This is my pseudocode. If touch is supported, then make the experience touch-friendly. Else, oh, just kidding, just keep everything touch-friendly, right? So this is big. This changes a lot of things. the biggest thing that gets affected by this is hover. Boy, do we love hover, right? We've been leaning on hover for a really, really long time. But now, we can't, right? So what do we do about that? Well, if the stuff that's hidden behind hover is primary content, it needs to be exposed. Just straight up, you need to have it on the screen, right? If it's secondary content, then defer it, right? You know, you don't need to have it in the page. If it exists on the next page or whatever, just let that page do its job. And then, of course, there's sort of the cop-out, which is you tap once and it'll expose the thing, and then you tap again and it goes away. But the big thing with this, the big important thing to notice about this is on these touch displays, right, we don't have the luxury of on mouse and keyboard inputs, what's known as sort of an accidental interaction, right? So you have like the big mega menus and stuff like that. Whenever you're on a mouse and keyboard, you hover over that navigation, even by accident, if you're trying to get to something else, and it triggers that sort of drop down. And the user goes, oh, okay, there's, you know, that exists, right? It's like a little discovery. But on touch devices, we don't have that luxury, right? So whenever they touch something, they've already made a decision, right? Touch equals intent, right? And basically, you know, you're shopping for a dress, you're shopping for something, and you say, I want that, right? By the time they touch the screen, they've made a decision. So give the people what they want, yeah? Look for opportunities to provide enhancements. Again, such as like swipe gestures and stuff like that, right? You have a photo gallery, look for the opportunity to sort of provide touch enhancements. Be mindful of ergonomics and how people hold their devices. This is tremendously important, especially now the sort of smartphone trend is that the screens are starting to get bigger, right? Which means that a lot of our sort of historical knowledge about things like, oh yeah, well, we put the navigation at the top, maybe doesn't make sense anymore, right? There's some great graphics that show sort of how things, you know, how tappable, how reachable things are, right? One-handed versus two-handed usage, mobile handset versus tablet usage, right? All of these things impact how people perceive your design. And I talked yesterday about getting into the browser sooner in our designs. And by getting into the browser sooner, we're able to test these things much, much, much earlier. You just can't test this stuff, how the design feels on a real device in a Photoshop copy. You just can't, right? Which is why it's so incredibly important, again, to get into the browser early and test there often, have your clients, have your bosses, have your colleagues all sort of, you know, firing it up on their personal devices and making sure that everything sort of feels good, right? Because it's not just about how it looks or what colors you're choosing for your buttons or whatever. It has everything to do with how the whole overarching experience feels. Okay. And beware of false positives. I'll talk about that in a bit. From a technical standpoint, whenever you touch a screen that has JavaScript touch events sort of available, a bunch of things happen in a bunch of different orders. Click event gets fired, on touch start, on mouse enter, all these things. This great guy, Patrick Lockheed, who works at Opera Software, he's done more research on this subject than anyone on the planet. So I definitely recommend checking out his work if you're the one sort of writing sort of JavaScript to make things sort of touch-friendly. And also, a new book just came out, and this is by my friend Josh Clark. I actually wrote the foreword for this book, so it's pretty cool. But this just actually literally came out last week, and it's all about designing for touch. And it's well worth your money, well worth your time to actually check this book out. And he talks about it not just from a web perspective, but also from a native perspective, by, again, going into the details about how you craft touch-friendly experiences. Okay. Everyone doing all right? Good? Okay, excellent. Yes?
Can you give the slide after the show?
Absolutely, yeah. What I'm going to do, just because I don't have everyone's email, I'm going to give the slides to the organizers, and then they'll make sure everybody gets them. Yep. Any other questions? Any questions about touch? Okay. Yes? Yeah, 3D touch. It's pretty interesting. I actually just upgraded my iPhone, and I think it's pretty cool. I think it's definitely pretty powerful. And I just read an article. I think it was actually just yesterday about sort of how it is a big step forward. It just gives, we want easy access to a lot of complex things. And it's really hard to do with just like a big dumb thumb touch. So this 3D touch gives us the opportunity, gives us a new dimension to sort of like long press on something or hard press on something and show some extra contextual stuff. Unfortunately for the web, and this is true with a lot of technologies, whether it's the Touch ID, like the fingerprint stuff, or other stuff like that, the web doesn't exactly have access to all the cool, latest, greatest features. So that, a lot of conversations happen around, do I make a native app or a web app or whatever? And the big thing is I'd say, if your app, if your service is relying on those device APIs that are only available in a native environment, then yeah, maybe making a native app is a good idea. That doesn't mean you shouldn't also have a web component to it, but let's say you need access to the thumbnail or the thumbprint sort of scanner or whatever, then you got to go with a native app. So we on the web don't have access to the 3D touch yet, but hopefully maybe one day we will. Yeah, so the question is like, should all buttons be at least 44 pixels high? That's what the research sort of says. That being said, it really depends on what the thing is, like what the touch target is. For example, like if it's a button that says add to cart or checkout or like whatever the primary thing is, I would say, yeah, absolutely, the button should be at least 44 pixels high so that people don't miss it, right? But if it's something like, extra details or sort of like secondary or tertiary actions, definitely keep in mind, like people are going to be touching it with their thumbs, but you don't necessarily need every single thing to be 44 pixels tall. Let's say like primary actions. Okay. All right. Let's talk about navigation. Navigation, the big consideration with navigation, especially on small screens, is that we simultaneously need it there, so it needs to be accessible, but it also needs to be unobtrusive, right? It needs to get out of our way, right? Because people don't come to your site to navigate necessarily, right? They come for the content. They come for the thing, right? So this is an example of a responsive website. Sort of isn't doing navigation very, very well. This is 3 different pages. You can sort of see the different active states. So the users have to scroll a whole page and a half just before they get to the content, right? So that's not exactly a good user experience. And whenever we talk about navigation, this issue comes up, the hamburger button, right? Oh, the omnipresent hamburger button. This is my friend Dan Mull, who I talked about a little bit yesterday. He has a site and that uses the hamburger icon, this little three burger sort of thing there, right? And the funny thing is that whenever you turn on his site, turns into a little hamburger. I think it's funny. I just like to show that because it's funny. He knows his audience, right? But this is sort of goofy. Anybody remember Esprit is like a fashion brand or whatever? They've been doing the hamburger icon before. It's cool. But this is their mobile website. They have the hamburger icon, and then their logo sort of has the hamburger icon. Maybe Adidas also sort of hamburger icon thing, right? So this is this very omnipresent symbol, and a lot of people did it.
and continue to do it just because it becomes this nice sort of shorthand for this is a menu. But the problem is, in a lot of the debate around this icon is this actually something that people understand, right? Is this something that's effective, right? And so this one company, XSWeb, and a few other places have started A/B testing how effective the hamburger is. In this XSWeb sort of experiment, they tested this, and this actually performed the worst. Adding a little border around it, something with like some nice like little rounded corners, something that just made it feel a bit more actionable, ended up getting a lot more interactions, right? And so that's just a good general best practice where it's like if something is actionable, it should look actionable, right? You should make it sort of give it that sort of buttony feel. And then there's this version, right? That gives it a little label that basically says, hey, this is a menu in addition to the hamburger icon. This actually performed worse than this one, interestingly enough, right? Maybe there's too much going on, I don't know, right? And the thing that worked the best, this. Interesting, right? So this isn't to say that this experiment proves without a doubt that you should never use a hamburger icon. But what it does say is that, being explicit, making things look actionable, definitely helps with usage, right? And I'd say this is sort of an overarching theme when it comes to navigation. If you're going to test anything on your website, make it navigation, right? This is a really important interaction of the site. You should be making sure that people know how to get around, make sure people know that navigation exists here, right? This is, again, my friend Luke Grabluski made this app called Polar, and he had these sort of 3 tabs across the top. And I believe it was whenever iOS 7 came out, they advocated to convert it into this little sort of drop-down kind of thing. And so instead of having these things exposed by default so that the user can read them and select between them, instead they sort of got tucked away. And again, this was something that Apple recommended. They said, hey, this is the pattern you want to use for this. And he saw the engagement drop dramatically. So again, surfacing things, making things more visible, more explicit is a good idea, right? It's hard to do. It's hard to balance because, again, we don't have a lot of screen space to deal with on these mobile screens. But at the same time, that's our challenge, right? That's our opportunity. Okay, so there's a few different patterns that I'm going to talk about for navigation. The first is what I call like the top nav or do nothing pattern. And what this means is that you simply display your links across the top. Now, this obviously isn't going to work on every website, especially if you have, you're working with languages and translations and, localizations and things like that, right? You're going to have maybe things wrap onto multiple lines and stuff, and that doesn't actually lead to a good design, but it keeps that stuff nice and actionable, right? Nice and exposed. There's this pattern called the footer anchor, where in the header you might have the menu button or the hamburger button, and whenever the user clicks on that, instead of actually sort of keeping the navigation itself in the header, we sort of have the navigation in the footer, and that sort of header link jumps the user down to the footer. This is sort of an interesting sort of pattern because it sort of follows this paradigm that's sort of established as a best practice where it's basically like the content first, right? That's what the users are really there for, and then navigation second, right? Not the other way around, right? It's not like, oh, hey, you came to our website, maybe you want to leave this page. Assume that the user wants to read the core content first, and then maybe navigate, right? Then there's the select menu. So this is basically taking this on small screens, converting this horizontal list of links down to a select menu. And this technically works. Again, it works, but I wouldn't say this isn't something I'd probably advocate for, at least for primary navigation. One, it's sort of like a form fish out of water. It just like this isn't a form, right? It's navigation. 2, it's actually sort of clumsy to have to tap into that select menu and sort of use the little sort of, up and down thing. Whether you're on Android, especially iOS, iOS only shows you 3 items at a time. So it's very inefficient to sort of navigate around. Then there's the toggle, and this is a popular pattern, right? Where you sort of have your trigger, your hamburger icon, or your menu button, or whatever, and it just sort of slides the menu down, right? Pushes the rest of the content down, exposes the navigation, and it keeps the user in their place. And this is sort of a nice pattern, right? This is something that's used quite a bit. So I'd say that this is quite nice. One of the biggest things that you want to consider, and again, this goes with any pattern you end up using, you want to make sure that, again, this works. And if JavaScript fails for whatever reason, and it will, right, you want to make sure that the user is still able to navigate your site, right? There's a flavor of this sort of toggle pattern that we might want to avoid. I'm just going to sort of show you this. This is Macy's.com, which is a big retailer in the US. What ends up happening, unfortunately, there's a flavor of this where instead of sliding the rest of the content down the page to make room for the menu, sometimes the menus will overlay on top of the core content. And the problem with this is that, especially on a lot of older Android devices, Android 2.x devices, Android 2.3 and stuff, are still very, very popular. And again, a lot of parts of the world, including here and stuff. What ends up happening on these devices is that whenever you overlay the menu on top of this stuff, this is a link, this is a link, this is a link. And if you have the close button there, whenever you go to click the close button, it actually triggers the link that's underneath it, right? Buggy stuff, right? But I found this a lot just with the mobile web in general, making things for mobile web browsers. Laying stuff on top of other stuff is sort of danger zone. You're going to end up having a lot of bugs, it's like a really quirky behavior, and this goes for light boxes, any sort of things wherever you're overlaying stuff on top of other stuff. So generally speaking, I advocate for sort of avoiding that sort of stacking, right, like absolute positioning, z-index, all that stuff, on small screens, and instead just sort of like slide stuff down, make room for it in other ways, sort of keep things on the same plane. Then there's the nav flyout, and this is a very popular one. This is what, up until sort of recently, Facebook has done. One upside of this pattern is that because it's sort of vertically stacking, you could include a lot of menu items in your navigation, right? One downside of this pattern is that you're able to include a lot of navigation items. Right? So I'll stress this. Use mobile as an opportunity to revisit your site's IA, or revisit your site's navigation. I did a project with Tiffany & Company, the big jewelry company, and they had big drop downs with all the stuff in it, 85 links. And we went through all their analytics and all their stuff and found that like 90% of their users clicked on 5 of those links, right? So use mobile as an opportunity, not just to sort of create a junk drawer where you just like throw all your crap, right, all your navigation in there, right? Use mobile as an opportunity to say, hang on, what's really important? What are our users actually doing? Okay. Then there's the priority plus pattern, and this is actually a really great pattern that I've sort of come back to as sort of thinking it more as a best practice. So what this site is doing is a sports site in the US, and so they're making a judgment call on what navigation items they think are important, right? And they're exposing those by default. And as, the overflow gets tucked behind this more button, right? So you can sort of see that as screen real estate increases, they're exposing more of the nav items. The Guardian, the UK newspaper site, they do the same thing, right? They're making a call as an organization, okay, these are the most important topics of our site. And then if the user doesn't see that, it's always available in the sort of drop down that shows all the items, right? What I like about this pattern is that, again, back to this idea of navigation should be accessible and sort of visible, especially those most important items, is that it's like, okay, we're making a call that like this stuff, these things are the most 3 or 4 important links, right? Everything else is still important to get to, but we can afford to sort of tuck it away. And this makes a good use of available screen real estate because as screen space increases, you can make use of it, right? It becomes pretty powerful. What I also really like about this, so Facebook used to have that sort of nav flyout, that sort of hamburger menu, sort of drawer kind of off-canvas pattern. And they've now gone to this, which is sort of attached to the footer of their app, right? Which again, coming back to ergonomics, is a little more thumb-friendly, right? It's there sort of towards the bottom of the screen. And what I like about this is that instead of having a single icon, like the hamburger button, do all the work for navigation, it exposes the most important stuff, so it helps the user recognize, like, oh, this is navigation. So let's say you're trying to start a new event on Facebook. You might start, at least in like, left to right sort of, well, yeah, like English-speaking countries and stuff where it's like left to right, top to bottom is how we read. So it's like, okay, I'll start at the news feed, and it's like, okay, I'm looking to set up an event. Maybe I'll find it here. No, that says news feed. Nope. Okay, I can't find it. I'll go here. Requests. Nope. Messenger. Nope. No, I'll keep going. Notifications. Nope. Still not there. Oh, there's the more button. Maybe it's in there, right? So it sort of helps like funnel users into that sort of overflow navigation, right? So it's like, we'll look for it, we'll scan the page, and then we'll if we don't find it, we'll go into the more button. And then there's what I like to call the hide and cry pattern, which is more of an anti-pattern than anything else. So this is a site called Authentic Jobs, which is a job posting site for people like us, designers and developers and stuff. And on the desktop size version, this is a responsive site, their desktop header, they have links that says post a job, pricing, about, guarantee, contact, sign in. But then whenever you shrink the browser onto sort of smaller viewports, all that goes away. And instead you're left with some weird Wi-Fi symbol, which I have absolutely no idea what that does. There's a little sort of geolocation icon, I guess for lack of a better word, and that's again sort of encouraging this sort of myth of the mobile context, where it's like, oh, mobile users are only on the go, and so therefore they just want content that's around them, which just isn't true. Right? Mobile users will do anything and everything a desktop user will do. It just needs to be there, right? And then search, which weirdly enough doesn't exist on the desktop site. So here you have an issue, right? Where post a job, okay? So a user wants to post a new job, right? Maybe your company's hiring. You want to post a job on their website. Why can't you do that from your mobile device? What's stopping you? Oh, that might be hard, right? The user has to type in a bunch of stuff on their phone. So what? Maybe you have an hour and a half or 2 hours to kill on a train on your ride home from work or something, right? Maybe that's the only tool you have at the time. Or maybe you need to hire freelancers like right now, and this is the device you have on you, right? Pricing. Shouldn't mobile users be able to know about your pricing or about your company if you're trustworthy? How about your guarantee, right? Those are all important things, right? Why shouldn't mobile users be able to read about your guarantee? Contact. Oh, who would contact somebody from their phone? That's ridiculous. A phone has never been used for communication. That's a joke. Of course people contact from their phones, right? So this is really important. And this doesn't just go for navigation, this goes for anything, right? If it doesn't make sense for mobile, if you're hiding it on mobile, you need to ask yourself, does this make sense at all, right? Why does this need to exist at all? If it doesn't make sense for mobile, it shouldn't exist at all, right? And this is a conversation to have with your clients, with your colleagues, with anyone that's saying, oh yeah, but mobile users wouldn't do that, right? Mobile users don't need this, right? You have to, like, anytime you hear that, there should be like huge alarm bells going off in your head. And again, you need to fight back. You need to say, hang on a second, right? If we're talking about hiding this on mobile, right, we need to have a conversation of like, is this important? And this comes back to this whole version of mobile first, right? This whole notion of mobile first, where it's like start with that small screen first, figure out what the right content is, right? Use those constraints to your advantage and create a better user experience, create better content, right? And again, this is more than just navigation. Okay. Complex navigation. So, we have, I just showed a bunch of sort of single level navigation, right? Like one list of links. But sometimes you work for a big organization with a bunch of different, multiple levels of layout and navigation drop downs and stuff like that. So there's a few different patterns that are pretty helpful for this. This one's called the multi-toggle, which is essentially just nested accordions. And what this is Microsoft's site. You tap on the little hamburger icon or whatever, and it drops down the sort of parent category links. The user skims over those parent category links, makes a decision, taps on products, and what that does is exposes all of the Microsoft products, right? So this is nice. It creates this nice little sort of flow wherever you're able to sort of scan the parent level categories, tap into the one you want, and then sort of keep tapping in. And so this is sort of like infinitely nestable, although I don't recommend that. Another thing worth pointing out with this pattern is that back to our conversations about touch, we used to expose these like drop-down menus and mega menus or whatever you want to call them whenever the user hovered over the label, right? But whenever they click that label, they would go through to like a landing page, right? But now, unfortunately, because we can't rely on hover, that label can't do double duty. So I actually really like how Microsoft solved this problem. Whenever you click on products, it exposes the list of products, right? But the very first link they have in here says all Windows products, right? So you're still able to provide the user the option to go to that landing page, right? Their product landing page. But then it goes into the individual products after that. So I think that's a really nice way of handling that. There's the skip the subnav pattern. This is the World Wildlife Federation, and on their small screen version of their website, they simply, if you click on threats, it links you through to the threats landing page. So what ends up happening is a lot of the stuff you see in a mega menu in a drop-down like that is often repeated on a landing page, right? So the users, whenever they get to the threats landing page, they could click through all those links, climate change, deforestation, things like that, right? So this isn't the most efficient pattern for mobile users, right? Because whenever they click threats, they have to wait for a whole nother page to load, and then they have to like sort of keep browsing. So it's not necessarily like the best user experience, but at the same time, it does sort of save some space. Then there's, this is a very new one. This is from the Tribeca Film Festival website in New York City just this year. What I really like about this pattern, so it's sort of using that same little sort of fly out kind of thing. And what I like about this is that it shows not just the top level navigation on the left, but also the sort of first level of sort of sub navigation, right? So this is pretty cool. I think that this is actually good use of screen real estate, where they're again, not just exposing the parent categories, but also at least one child category. That's pretty cool. Okay, So that's navigation. Again, the biggest challenge with navigation is finding that balance between accessibility and unobtrusiveness, right? It needs to be there, and it needs to be quickly accessible, but at the same time, you don't want it to get in the way of the core content of your site, right? Again, because this is such a crucial interaction on your site, make sure you're testing it in as many environments as possible. Make sure it works. If JavaScript fails for whatever reason or isn't available at all, right? Make sure that it works on small screens, large screens, everything in between. And again, be explicit with that icon, right? Make sure you're trying to surface that stuff and make it really obvious to the user, like, hey, this is where navigation is. Any questions? Yes?
I think the Microsoft thing just showed was intriguing. The concept of like drop downs is well accepted on, say, a desktop device. When you're doing something like that, I mean, is it loading a different menu than what loads on the desktop site? Because sometimes you want to have that top level navigation be a landing page, but on a mobile device, you're trying to send people somewhere else using the same sort of menu. Are there different ways to deal with, adaptively loading, conditionally loading different menus
Okay.
on desktop? Do you understand what I'm
Yes,
saying?
yes. Yeah, so the question is, like, is this the same markup on small screens as it is the desktop screens? Or do you just sort of have like a mobile nav and it's like display none, and then using like media queries or something to switch them on, or even, like conditionally loading different menus based on the context? Generally speaking, and it really depends, I would tend to encourage using the same markup across the board and sort of using media queries and things, and you can use like media queries to dramatically alter the style and the behavior of these things. Back to the topic of on desktops, right? We want that sort of hover interaction or something like that. Again, I check out Patrick's work. There's ways to have hover, but this is actually sort of how like iOS and Android behave by default. They'll actually treat clicks as hover events. So if you sort of write your JavaScript in the right way, you could sort of have sort of a hover and sort of tap sort of trigger the same thing. So it's possible, but I wouldn't count on that. And again, I'd say even on large screens on the Microsoft site, they're using a click event to, if you go to like Microsoft.com and click on products on your large screen, the subnav triggers on a click rather than on a hover. And you're starting to see that with more and more sites just because, again, we just can't rely on hover anymore.
I guess maybe, is this turn on? Okay. I guess maybe like, so say like I have like a website and I have a products page, and that on my desktop it's products, and if they click on the products it goes to a list of all the products.
Yep.
But there's also a drop down. On this thing there's a products, and I push that and that pulls out another nav, so it's kind of bypassing that landing page like you were saying.
Correct.
Is that's more what I'm asking.
Yeah.
How would I deal with that?
Yeah, and again, like I think that Microsoft did a good job where even on large screens, the products label serves as the trigger in the trigger only, and then that first item in the dropdown says all Windows products. So that will take you through to the landing page. And again, like even whenever you have more space, maybe you could even add like a bit more branding and like other things and sort of like style it to like encourage people to go through the landing page.
Sure. I guess my question is, a little bit more technical.
Okay. Oh, sure.
Like, what happens, so that would be a different products link than the one that's on my desktop, because they're adding a link in there that shows you all the products, but the products link on this one just opens the sub-nav. You get what I'm saying? I mean, is it a different link, or is it a behavior that's applied to the same link?
Yeah, I think it's a behavior that's assigned to the same link. So I would use JavaScript to like on the products link. Let's just say like by default it's like ahref/products, right? And then I would use JavaScript to go like prevent default, right, so that it doesn't click through to that link and instead would trigger the dropdown. Yep, cool. How's everyone doing? It's good? Okay. All right. How much time do we have? We got 30 minutes. Wait, who said that? Okay, all right. Are you okay if we keep going? Or are you guys good? Everyone good? Okay? This is like a power session. I think that we actually sort of like lost a little time. So if it's okay with you, we'd like sort of just keep going. All right? Okay, cool. You guys are troopers. Thank you very much. Okay, I sort of say that just because this is sort of a hard topic. So images is a really, really hard topic, very, very important topic. This is why this is a very important topic. If you look at, this site is awesome. If you haven't checked out the HTTP archive site, there's like tons of stats on tons of stuff about web pages and trends in general. The unfortunate reality is that the average web page now weighs about 2.2 megs. And overwhelmingly, as you can see, images make up these web pages, right? So the bulk of our web page heft, weight, is from images, right? This is depressing. And this site, back to our conversation about performance, there's a really cool site called What Does My Site Cost? And you could actually plug in your URL. And what it does is it uses like data plans and like cost per byte and stuff from all over the world. And you could see how much you're costing your users for that web page to load. Right? So this is cool. So there's a bunch of different image considerations we have. Different screen sizes, obviously. The growth of all these high-res screens, retina screens, and things like that. Bandwidth is still a huge consideration. The need for art direction, which we'll talk about. Different image formats, right? Is it a PNG? Is it a JPEG? Is it a GIF? Is it an SVG? Right? Image types, background images versus icons versus actual semantically important images, right? There's tons and tons of different considerations. So let's start by talking about background images. We won't spend too long talking about background images because the good news is that they actually work like they're supposed to. So using media queries, all that stuff we were talking about earlier, all right, you can define different size background images. So let's say you have a design and it's got this big, beautiful, splashy picture of forests or trees or mountains or whatever, right, in the background. And the only way people are going to see that is if they're on, you know, like a 27-inch screen, right? So we want to follow those same mobile-first CSS best practices where by default, right, we want to load in a small image or maybe not an image at all, right? And then only whenever the screen is large enough to display that background image, then we load in that background image, right? So the good news is that browsers actually do the right thing. They don't download all the images, right? So you're not burdening your users with a bunch of extra downloads. Okay? Okay. So that's backgrounds. Who had the question about background images? Was that you? Sorry. Okay. All right. Good.
Brad, I have a question.
Sure.
How do you manage this when the content type where the user just goes and uploads and says, here's my...
Yeah. Yeah, how do you manage that dynamically in the context of a CMS? And the answer is it's going to depend, you know. So you might have, let's say, like that background image of the forest or whatever is part of just like the overall theme. And so that would be like static asset, so it doesn't need managed. The other thing, and I'm not exactly sure how Joomla specifically does this, but I know that other content management systems and stuff, using things like ImageMagick, which is like a PHP library, you could upload, you know, the user uploads an image once, and then the system, the CMS, could just be like, spit out a small version, medium version, large version, extra large version, whatever. So that's something that is really, really helpful. And I can sort of talk about that a little bit more when we talk more about other things, but this is currently a pain point for a lot of people. So everyone's trying to figure out like how to make these sort of different image assets content manageable. Yep.
Just real quick, is that the only way to deal with background? There's no way to make a background image say responsive in the same way that like a normal image kind of
Oh yeah.
just with expansive.
Yeah.
You would just is that the
So it's a background, yeah, there's a property called background size, and you could set it to background size 100%, and then that will sort of like stretch and scale the same way like a responsive image would. Yep. There's a bunch of cool stuff you could actually do. It's like background size, there's one called contain and cover, and it'll sort of like, it'll sort of bleed out and fuzz out, like depending on like what you tell it to do, you could actually have some really cool controls. What's that?
Percentage of depth.
Yeah, yep. Yeah, so background positioning and background size and stuff are really powerful.
would you recommend dealing with what you just showed us that actually loads a different image? I can see where you're going with that.
Yep.
Is that a better way to go than just saying have like one large background image you would use on desktop that would scale?
Well, so that's the thing. So the question was, well, shouldn't you just like have one big, the picture of the forest that's like 1,600 pixels wide, and then we could just sort of use CSS and say like, oh, we want the background size to be 100%. The problem is that now you have a 320 pixel size screen downloading a 1,600 pixel wide image, which is like, is going to at least be 100K if you're lucky.
So I guess then maybe a combination of those two.
Precisely. Yep. Precisely. And again, the beauty of media queries is that you could be like, whenever you hit this breakpoint, apply whatever rules, and you could write, you could say background green on small screens and background blue and in this image and background size, contain, and all that stuff within your media query. Yep. But yeah, and I think just to reiterate this point, one of the main things we want to do with images across the board, whether it's a background image or an actual like IMG tag or whatever, is that we don't want to send huge images to small screens, right?
I have a general question.
Sure.
I have a general question in CSS. Is pixel or EM preferred in response to this?
Yes, yeah, so sort of talked about this a little bit earlier, but yeah, so is pixel or M preferred? And generally speaking, M's and other relative units like percentages and rems and stuff are preferred over pixels. Anymore, I'm not really writing pixels unless I'm making a 1 pixel border around something, right? So, and the reason for that is that there's a variety of screen sizes, there's a variety of DPI, so like screen density. So like you have like low-end Android devices are sort of like blown out and bigger and sort of fuzzier, and then you have like retina-sized screens and stuff like that. And basically those M units handle that stuff and normalize out a little bit, whereas pixel units get misinterpreted. Yep. Okay. Oh, yes. What's that? Oh, ping? Oh, WebP images. Yeah, so to quickly touch on WebP, and I'll talk about, hang on, hold on to that thought. I'll bring it back up whenever we talk about the picture element. Yes?
How to deal with heavy size images. Sometimes the content loads first and images takes a lot of time to load. So how to deal with this?
Yeah, so how do you sort of dynamically load larger size images, or how do you not using CSS? The unfortunate reality is that's sort of like out of CSS's hands. Is like file size and stuff. So there's a few good best practices to follow, irrespective of what kind of image it is. If it's a CSS background image or an actual image that's in your markup, you want to sort of save it out at the appropriate size. So again, like don't send down a 2,000 pixel wide image to even like a 900 pixel size screen. Like you want to make sure that you're cropping the image to the appropriate size. Also, there's a tool. Has anybody used Image Optim in here? Image Optim is a free tool. It's a little drag and drop thing, and you just drag your images on top of it, and it strips out some of like metadata and other sort of stuff. So it's sort of like a lossless compressor that actually shaves off significant sort of, image size, so file size, and there's no noticeable like quality difference or anything like that. So there's some general things that you could do to make sure that the images you're serving are optimal, just in general. But then there are some other things, and we'll talk about this in a second, to sort of swap different sources. So on small screens would get a small source, medium-sized screens would get a medium source, large screens would get a large source. And I'll talk about how to do that in a second. Is that helpful? Okay, cool. All right. So before we talk about like actual like semantically important images, it's also worth talking about icons. Anybody familiar with IcoMoon? This is a fantastic tool. Definitely recommend checking it out. Icon fonts. What we're able to do with icon fonts, if you're familiar with using web fonts in general, icon fonts are essentially a special web font that uses rather than sort of displaying A, B, C, D, E, F or whatever, is displaying these characters, right? These icons. And what IcoMoon does is that you're able to either upload your own icons or use theirs or whatever, and you can pick which ones you want, and then you say, okay, generate an icon font out of this, and it'll spit out a nice little zip file with all of your styles for it, all of the different characters, and including like SVG and pings and stuff like that. Really, really nice. It's a great tool. I definitely recommend using it. The problem is, so I like using icon fonts a lot. You're able to style and scale them and stuff the same way you would anything else in CSS, right? So if you want to make the color yellow, you just say color yellow, right? It's as easy as that. If you want to give it a font size of 2 Ms, then you could give it a font size of 2 Ms. It's just sort of nice. It's nice. It's easy. The problem is, though, it's a bit of a hack, right? Making sort of a web font that's just your icons is clever, but it's a bit of a hack. And what ended up happening is that some smart people said, hang on a second, not every environment supports web fonts, right? Most notably, Opera Mini. If you're familiar with Opera Mini is a proxy browser. So basically, the thing gets rendered, the page gets rendered on the server, and then gets sent down to the client as this sort of compressed sort of web page. And because it's really focused on performance, and especially on sort of like lower powered devices and older devices and stuff, it sort of strips away some things, which includes web fonts, right? So you have Opera Mini has a user base of 400 million people, many of them in this part of the world. So that's a big deal, right? Suddenly your users can't see your hamburger menu icon, or can't see your search magnifying glass icon, or whatever. So that's an issue. But at the same time, I still really like icon fonts. I like it's simple, it's flexible. So here's what I do. And again, this is just my experience. I can't speak like objectively as like this is what you should always do. This is what works for me. I use icon fonts for sort of decorative icons. So this is from the Time Inc. site I talked about yesterday. And if you look at this little caret here, this little right-facing arrow, that's an icon font, right? So that's being generated in CSS and whatever. But at the same time, if icon fonts aren't loaded, say on Opera Mini or whatever, the user is still able to read that button that says Learn More. They're still able to click on it. So no harm, no foul. It's just a decorative icon. So it's like, okay, that's fine. But for mission-critical icons, this is where we want to take advantage of SVG. So with SVG, so this is the footer of the Time Inc. website. And what we're doing here is we have these Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn icons, right? Those are actually mission-critical icons, right? Those are actionable things, right? That's like your hamburger menu or your magnifying glass or any other sort of icon that's meant to be seen by the user and interacted with. So for these, we want to use SVG, right? And SVG stands for Scalable Vector Graphics, which means that no matter if you're on a retina size screen, a regular size screen, a triple X screen or whatever, it's going to look crisp and clean and beautiful, right? So we want to be using SVG. We want to be using sort of vector graphics as much as possible. Whether it's icon fonts or whether it's SVG, we want to be using these sort of resolution-independent graphics for icons as much as possible. And then, of course, not every environment supports SVG, IE 8 and below, Android 2 point whatever and below, stuff like that. But the good news is that we can detect for SVG support. And by default, we could serve up ping images, or as a fallback, we could support ping images. And then if SVG is supported, then we could override that and display an SVG, right? So that sort of creates this nice sort of fallback content. There's other tools out there. One's called Grunticon that will take a folder of SVG icons and we'll run it through a process and we'll spit out pings and spit out the appropriate styles. There's an online tool to help you do that as well. We could talk more about the details after the workshop. Okay, so the big thing about icons is that we want to vectorize as many things as possible. We want to use icon fonts, but beware that they're not supported everywhere. We want to use SVG with the appropriate fallbacks. And again, this is just, in my experience, this is sort of how I've been doing things. I use my icon fonts for decorative icons, and then use SVG and pings and stuff for mission-critical icons. Okay? Any questions about icons real quick before we move on? Yes?
My team is moving away from icon font,
Yes.
moving to SVG, right?
Yes.
So I think, yeah, that's,
Mm-hmm.
do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think generally, and again, other people have been moving away from icon fonts altogether and are just using SVG now. And I say if that works for you, that's great. I personally still really like icon fonts because I could just manipulate them in CSS. Whereas using SVGs, there's just like, there's a little more of like a burden. It's a little harder. And I think I just need to get in there and actually sort of give it another play. But generally speaking, yeah, that's what a lot of people, Chris Coyer and Sarah Sudin, who's from Lebanon, these are people that talk about SVG very enthusiastically. So if you're not familiar with like CSS tricks and sites like that, definitely give those a look over because there's lots of great articles on using SVGs and using SVGs specifically for icons and stuff like that as well. So yeah, so I think that that's good. That being said, again, I sort of have a soft spot in my heart for icon fonts.
My observation is that recently Chrome, they didn't, for support for icon font is really terrible.
Oh, really? Yeah, so Chrome's icon font support is sort of terrible. Ah, that's interesting. Yeah, I've definitely noticed, and again, that has to do with how browsers render web fonts in general. You'll have some people complain about like fuzziness and stuff like that. So yes, things to be considerate of. Okay. So now what we're going to talk about is like real actual images, right? These are things that like need to exist in the DOM, right? IMG SRC, right? These are things that are important, semantically important to the document. There's a few different solutions we're going to talk about. The first is called compressive images. And the compressive images basically means, and this is sort of crazy, sort of upscaling our images a bit, or starting from like sort of a bigger width and height, but then manipulating the image quality size. So this person in the Netherlands went into Photoshop, they upscaled the image by 100%, which isn't usually a good practice, and then went into the Save for Web prompt and squashed the quality down to like 0%, which is also not a good practice, but then put it back in the browser and then squished it down to its original size. And wouldn't you know, it actually looked good. And it actually looked good not just on regular resolution displays, but also like Retina displays as well. And moreover, that bigger image, that compressed image, actually weighed a lot less than the image he started with, which is crazy. And as it turns out, an image's compression rate matters more for determining JPEG's file size than the actual width and height dimensions of it. So long story short is how I've been sort of approaching a lot of images in my sites has been to sort of have like a bit bigger, maybe not like 2 times as big, but a bit bigger of a sort of an image source, and making sure, again, I'm using things like image optim. I'm not like sort of making them gigantic images, but I'm sort of compressing them a bit, not to 0%, but a little bit, and then sort of scaling them down just a bit in the browser. So that's sort of how I'm doing things for the most part. And this is nice because you don't have to swap out image assets or anything like that. It's just sort of optimizing the actual image itself to make sure that it looks good on screens and high-res screens and different image sizes. So that's like using just like IMG SRC. But what ended up happening as responsive design started taking off is that people said, you know what? This just isn't enough. We need more power, we need more flexibility, and unfortunately, just IMG SRC is just too dumb to handle all of these different scenarios. In the big scenario, one of the main things that we're struggling with is, again, this notion of, well, we have, let's say, like a big hero image, right? A big splashy image on the homepage, right? And on desktop size screens and stuff, we're talking like 1600 pixels for this image, right? Big and bold and whatever, right? Obviously, it's not a good idea to send down that 1600 pixel image to smaller screens. So there's this new thing called source set. And what source set is, so here we have IMG SRC, small, right? We're used to that. But now we have this new chunk called source set, this new HTML attribute called source set. And what we're doing is we're giving the browser extra information. We're saying, hey, browser, I have not just this small version of this image. I have this small version of the image that's 500 pixels wide. I have a medium version of the same image that's 1,000 pixels wide. And I have a large version of this JPEG that's 2,000 pixels wide. And what this allows us to do, this gives the browser extra information. So as the browser scans the page, it goes, oh, hey, looks like there's a few different images for me to choose from. And it goes, okay, well, how big is the viewport size, right? What's the pixel density? But then this also opens the door for maybe the browser gets smarter in the future. Maybe there's a user setting that says, always send me high-res images, or never send me high-res images because I'm traveling or something, right? So the browser makes a decision based on whatever the environment is and serves the appropriate image, right? So if you're on like an old crappy or like let's say like a basement level Android device or something that's like, has a tiny screen or whatever, the browser's going to say, oh, okay, this is on a small screen, not a very high resolution image. I'm going to serve small.jpg, right? But then you might be on the new iPad Pro, right, which has this big screen and it's Retina and whatever, and the browser says, oh, okay, it's got these dimensions, it's Retina, so it's a 2x sort of pixel display. I'm going to send down the large version of that same image, right? So the big thing to take away with this technique, with this new technology, is that source set allows us to give the browser extra information, and the browser makes a decision on which image to pick. Does that sort of make sense? Okay. And then there's sort of this other thing that goes alongside it, which is what's called sizes. And this sort of gets challenging and gets a little complicated, because what we're doing is we're saying, okay, maybe for the hero image, it's always going to be this like big full bleed thing, and it's always going to be 100% of the viewport width, which is what that 100 VW is. It says, hey, this image is always going to display at full width, right? But that might not always be the case, right? Maybe you have some like touts or something that eventually display in like sort of 3 columns. So what we could do is provide extra information to the browser that basically says, hey, if the screen is at least 60 ems wide, these images are going to display as 40 ems wide, right? So it's basically, you basically tell the browser, here's what size of box this image is going to display in. And then the browser is going to, again, calculate all that stuff and pick the right size of image to choose. Okay? My friend Jason Grigsby has written just a beautiful series of posts on responsive images, including like everything. And but his part on like sizes and all this, again, you'll have the slides, you'll have the links to this, but I definitely recommend checking out his series on responsive images. He's done a better job than any other person on this planet at actually describing this stuff, because it's confusing, it's new, and he really does a great job at laying it all out. Okay, so in addition to source set, so source set is primarily used for swapping out different versions of the same image, right? So you have, again, you have a big version, you have a small version, maybe a medium version, and you're just sort of switching between them, right? But there's other occasions where we might need to go beyond just basic resolution switching. So this is an example that, again, Jason uses in his posts. Here's a picture of President Obama, and he's speaking at an automotive plant, right? You can sort of see that context, on the big size version of the image, right? But whenever that sort of gets squashed down onto small screens, you sort of lose that context, right? You can't really tell what's going on. It's like, it sort of looks like there's a guy. He might be about to be eaten by a transformer or something. I can't really tell what this image is, right? So what we're talking about, what Jason talks about, is what's known as the art direction use case. We want to make a decision that, okay, on small screens, we actually want to display sort of a different crop of the same image, right? So that gives sort of like a different sort of look and feel, but you could tell, okay, that's President Obama or whatever, right? So we're able to sort of swap different sort of crops of an image out, right? Maybe you have like one sort of portrait version of a hero image and then one like landscape or something, right? So this is what this looks like. This is a new HTML element called the picture element, and we have the picture, and then inside it we have different sources. So we say, okay, there's a picture element, and if the screen is 45 ems wide, we want to plug in the large version of the JPEG, okay? If the screen is 18 ems wide, we want to plug in the medium size image, right? And then by default, we want the small version of the JPEG. And then there's sort of the fallback and accessible text sort of in there. The big difference here is rather than, unlike source set, which we just talked about, which gives the browser extra information to decide which one to choose, the browser is making the decision. With picture, what we're doing is we're saying, okay, I have a different crop of this image, and I always want this image to load, right? These are, instead of extra information to the browser, with the picture element, it's explicit instructions to the browser. It says, always load the JPEG whenever these conditions are true. Always load the medium versions when these conditions are true. So this is a site for my wife's jewelry studio that we just did like a week or two ago. Me and my brother were working on it. And you can see by default on the small screen sort of size, there's this picture, right? You can see that. But as we increase the screen space, eventually we swap out sort of a different crop of that image. And then on larger screens, we're able to sort of swap in a different image altogether, right? So we're using the picture element to say, okay, whenever we get to a certain breakpoint, then we're going to sort of swap these image sizes out. Okay? Does this sort of make sense? Okay. So the big one, and this is, again, this is all confusing. It's very new. I've only just myself gotten my head around this. But which one to choose, and Chris Coyer really helped me out. He says the source set and sizes, again, is to help help the browser decide which image is best. But the browser is ultimately the one making the decision, right? The picture element is like, hey, browser, do this thing, right? Do this thing only, right? I'm explicitly commanding you, the browser, to do it, right? Okay. For whichever, whether you're using source set or the picture element and all that stuff, you're going to use the picture fill, polyfill, which is a little JavaScript polyfill that makes the picture element work and makes source set work even in older browsers. So if you're like supporting IE8 or IE9 or like older versions of Firefox or whatever, things that don't support the picture element natively yet. The picture element's new. I think it's in Chrome. It's in Firefox now. Last I checked, it wasn't in Safari yet. So again, you're going to use this little polyfill, and it'll work in those sort of unsupported browsers. Okay, and again, you'll have the slides. I rounded up a bunch of sort of recent resources on responsive images. Whew. Okay, how's everyone doing? This is a sort of nice little, this is my dog.
That's you?
Yep, that's me. And this is how I feel about responsive images. Okay. All right. So quickly, all right, how much time we got? Half hour so far as I'm concerned. Jeez, all right. Ready? We're gonna power through this stuff. I'm like, all right. Media, we'll talk about video. The big thing about video is that unlike images, they don't maintain their aspect ratio whenever you squish them down. There's a nice little trick. You could do it purely in CSS. There's a nice little JavaScript plugin called FitVids that basically you just chuck this into your site, and basically like any YouTube video or Vimeo video or whatever will maintain its aspect ratio whenever you squish and resize the browser. So that's really all I'll say about that. But now we're going to talk about something quite interesting. Up until now, we've been talking about, reflowing layout and making sure that like images look well. But for the most part, it's just, putting stuff on the page. But there are certain areas, there are certain patterns that need something more than just making it squishy, making it just sort of like look good on small screens. And tell me if this has ever happened to you. You're on a website, and you're scrolling down the page, and then suddenly you're scrolling in a map. And you're scrolling, and you're scrolling, and you're trapped in the map, right? This happens all the time, right? And so this is sort of an issue. Meanwhile, on these smartphones, on our Androids, on our iPhones, and stuff like that, the Maps app is one of the coolest apps we have, right? I love Maps. I use Maps like every day. So it's not a good user experience to force people to interact with this little embedded map that's the size of a postage stamp, right? And sort of like move their thumb and they can't get out of it and stuff. It's very, very awkward, right? So what we can do is use that same conditional loading technique we talked about earlier to create a much better user experience. So here's what we're going to do. By default, instead of embedding an iframe, we can just have a button that says View Map, and that would link to, say, like Google Maps, right? Better yet, we could even use the Google Maps static API to pull in a static image, right, like a JPEG or a PNG of that map, and wrap that in a link that links to Google Maps. So now the user, whenever they scroll down the page, they no longer get trapped in an iframe, but they could see the map. And now, if they want to view the map, they could click on a link to Google Maps, right? What's awesome is that links to Google Maps is like one of the only links that the native mobile operating system actually hijacks. Whenever you click a link to Google Maps, the operating system goes, oh, wait, looks like you're trying to go to Google Maps. Well, if I got the app for you, and it goes and it opens Google Maps and it puts the latitude and longitude of that pin into the Maps app. And now all of a sudden, you're in the native Maps app where you're one tap away from turn-by-turn directions. You have access to all your favorites, all your bookmarks, all of your contacts, right? This is a much, much, much better user experience, right? And then, again, using that conditional loading technique we talked about earlier, what we could say is, okay, whenever the screen is large enough to properly handle that iframe, right, that embeddable Google map, we could go ahead and use some JavaScript to basically replace that static image with the actual embedded map, right? So again, whenever there's enough room for the user to properly sort of pan around and get out of the iframe, we could say, okay, now it's safe to load that iframe. So again, we're creating this transformative experience, right, that takes advantage of the unique capabilities of mobile, but then also creating this better experience for large screen users as well. So I personally really love talking about this because this is just one instance where we're going beyond just sort of simple translation. Let's take a map, let's take an embeddable map and just make it squishy, right? Instead we're saying, hang on a sec, let's think about how this actual behavior works and let's take advantage of it. Light boxes is another one. Light boxes. Okay, well, let's take this desktop convention, this light box, and we'll make it squishy. Well, let's see how that looks. Uh-huh. Yep. Uh-huh. Yep. Not exactly the best user experience, right? I want to see what this infographic says, so I tap on it, and it pulls up the light box on top of it. It's actually a bit smaller than the thumbnail image, right? This isn't exactly a good user experience, right? This is another example where it's not just like, oh, okay, well, we have these light boxes, and we need to make those flexible. We need to have a conversation and say, well, hang on a sec. How should this operate? Same thing goes if you think of things like Facebook. On the desktop Facebook experience, there's modal windows everywhere. Again, just like these sort of like light box style things that are sitting on top of the other content. But on their native apps and their mobile website, creating a new event, for example, has this nice dedicated screen. What we can do is, first and foremost, we could use, again, that same conditional loading technique we talked about earlier, and we could say, okay, by default, what we're going to do is link to that raw image, that infographic or whatever, or that chunk of content, that form or whatever. And then we're going to say, okay, if the screen is large enough to handle a light box, then let's include that light box. But by default, let's just instead link to that raw chunk of content, maybe open it in a new tab. So here's what that looks like, right? On large screens, there's enough room for a light box to display comfortably. But then whenever we lose our screen real estate, what we're doing instead, whenever you click on the image, is it jumps you to a new tab and loads in that image. And now you could pinch and zoom and pan around and actually see the content of that image. And then whenever you're done, you could like hit the back button or close that tab and go back to the main thing, right? So this creates a much more accessible user experience, right? Okay. Briefly, talking about advertising. So this is what responsive websites look like, this nice squishy Jello mold. They're beautiful, they're delicious. Advertising. Who works on sites with advertising on them? Like banner ads or anything like that? Okay, only a few of you, sorry. Because these banner ads are like putting bricks inside a Jello mold, right? They're these sort of fixed width pieces of crap that are terrible and ruin an otherwise fluid experience. So how do we deal with this, right? We have these different image sizes, these banner image sizes and stuff like that. And first and foremost, it's so important to, again, get into the browser sooner, get into the browser faster, put those banner images in the place where the ad spec or whatever necessitates them, and start designing around them. This is the site that I worked on for Entertainment Weekly. And what we did you could sort of see this image of The Simpsons, maybe gets a bit too big, but we had to have our breakpoint wherever that ad said it was. Right? This is how the ads are sold. They basically say, on this size screen, the ad needs to be there, right? So that influenced how we designed the site. And unfortunately, you know, we sort of had to compromise a bit, right? We had to sort of design around these fixed width things, right? But it doesn't have to be all bad. This is a good example of an ad that I was like, whoa, you see that? Everybody see that? A nice little subtle effect. And then you shrink the browser, and it actually turns into this like nice mobile optimized form. So it's not impossible to create good advertisements for responsive things. It's just that the ad world is like 5 years behind everybody else, unfortunately. So I think that there's a lot of opportunity to sort of make this stuff happen. But in the meantime, again, you just sort of have to deal with it and design around it. But by getting into the browser faster, you're able to sort of see those challenges earlier. Okay, data tables. There's a few who works on sites with data tables, wherever you're displaying like tables, T-head, T-body, and stuff like that, displaying some numbers in a table. There's a bunch of different patterns that we can use to make better experiences for tables, right? So here's one table, and whenever we lose screen real estate, this pattern sort of converts everything into this sort of nice vertically stacked key value pair sort of configuration. And this might work for certain kinds of data. Here's another one that's sort of quite similar, table to list. So we have our table, and then whenever we're on smaller screens, it sort of collapses into this nice little chunk, this nice little sort of card pattern. I use this one on a lot of my sites. I think it actually works really quite well, where it's like, okay, here's this little cluster of information that's just vertically stacked, but on larger screens, we can sort of display them all at once. Yeah? Priority columns. This is sort of an interesting one, where we're saying certain data is more important to display than others, right? And so what ends up happening on small screens, we're basically saying, okay, we're only going to display these 3 columns of text. Everything else is going to get tucked away and will be buried under this little display drop-down, right? But as screen space becomes available, we're going to conditionally expose those other columns. That's a pretty cool pattern. Link to full table. This one's quite similar to that conditional light box I just showed, where on small screens, right, there's not enough room to display things as rows and columns, but what we could do is open that table in a new tab where the user can pinch and zoom and pan around, right? So this is especially helpful for tables that need that sort of rows and columns sort of configuration, yeah? Horizontal overflow. This is sort of an interesting one, where basically on small screens, the header of the table sort of docks to the left, and the user can sort of scroll over and read more. This is an interesting pattern. Unfortunately, this is like what Wikipedia's mobile site uses. They have tons of data tables on their site. Unfortunately, not every environment, not every browser supports overflow scroll. Most notably, like Android 2.x doesn't support overflow scroll. So that's an issue. There's also the issue of, well, how does the user know that there's more columns, right, off screen, right? Maybe you could add a little sort of gradient or something that sort of hints to the user, like, hey, there's more content over here. How about you swipe over, right? Okay. If you want to use any of these patterns, the Filament group has created a little JavaScript library that rounds a lot of these things up for you to use. Any questions on data tables? Okay. All right. The home stretch, guys. Home stretch. And then we have, like, I think another keynote. So, all right. Let's talk about modules, specifically carousels or sliders or whatever you call them. Should I use a carousel.com? No. So carousels are sort of challenging bits, challenging little guys. And as it turns out, and this site, shouldiuseacarousel.com, actually rounds up a lot of really good stats on sort of why carousels or sliders or whatever aren't exactly a good user experience. My friend who works at a university in the States found that 1% of their users ever clicked on the next button to get to the second slide, right? So it's like, well, if you're making this really complicated UI widget where a bunch of people are arguing over what goes inside it and there's a bunch of testing and stuff, and 1% of the people ever get to the next slide, it's like, come on, right? So this is just being sort of proven over and over again that maybe this isn't the most effective pattern. So make sure you actually need one. Have a conversation with your team, show them this data and say, I don't know, maybe we want to try something differently. People like to lean on these things because it's sort of easy to appease everyone. It's like, oh yeah, you could be in the carousel, you could be in the carousel, you could be in the carousel, who cares, right? Everybody gets what they want, but nobody wins. But if you do have to make a carousel, make sure you're cycling through similar content types. Only load what you need. If you have like 14 items in your carousel, please don't load 14 big heavy images by default. Lazy load, conditionally load those images. Be explicit with the navigation. These 3 tiny, teeny little dots do not help the user understand that they could swipe over, right? This is actually a previous version of Yahoo's mobile homepage. And I actually think that this is a good example of how to do a carousel right. So one, all the items in the carousel are news stories, right? So you're able to sort of just, similar content types. There's nice big previous, chunky previous and next buttons, right? That helps the user say, okay, here's how you can navigate. You could swipe, using touch. It gives you a nice little indicator of where you're at in the flow. I actually think that this is really quite good, right? It's nice and usable. Also, suggest more content to users, treat touch as an enhancement, provide gestural hints. I'll show you another example. This is from Zappos, which is a shoe e-commerce site. And their mobile site had this really nice sort of, they show this other shoe. You guys see that? Where it's like, oh, hey, here's another image. Maybe you want to swipe over, right, and see that other image. And I think that that's really cool. It's sort of a nice, clever, playful way of showing those other things. But here's the problem. Not every browser, not every device supports JavaScript touch events, right? So this is an issue. And so this is Opera Mini, which we talked about earlier about icon fonts. They also don't support JavaScript touch events. So now the user has no way of getting over to see that other image, right? That's a bad user experience. But thankfully, following things like progressive enhancement allow us to sort of treat touch as an enhancement, right? Treat that JavaScript as an enhancement. So by default, all the designers, all the developers need to do is include a little like next button or like a little arrow or something. And then the user can tap on that arrow, that previous next button, and actually navigate through to the next thing. And then if touch is available, then you can enhance up from there. There's also another kind of sort of carousel that's not exactly like a homepage carousel, but this is what I call like the reveal. If you look at Amazon.com, it's not a responsive site, but it's fluid, right? And what ends up happening is that as screen space becomes available, they expose more related product, right? And this is pretty smart, right? Exposing more related products means more eyeballs, means more clicks, means more purchases, means more money, right? This is a smart pattern. And it's actually a very good use of screen real estate, right? So you're not just sort of creating like a one or all experience, you're basically conditionally exposing more stuff whenever there's the space to do so. Disney.com also does a similar thing, right? Again, they have this nice little overflow, that little sort of thing that's overhanging that basically suggests to the user, hey, there's more content to be had here. How about you swipe over and see it? And then as screen real estate becomes available, they expose more stuff. Okay, quickly, tabs and accordions. Tabs are a really effective desktop or like large screen size software pattern, but they don't necessarily translate well to smaller screens. So I think that this is a super clever, super effective pattern that basically converts those tabs into sort of a vertically stacked accordion, right? And that will work quite nicely on small screens. And then, of course, whenever there's enough space to convert that back to tabs, it will do so. There's another version that's basically an accordion on small screens, right? Let's say you have a long content site like Wikipedia. And on small screens, it could operate like Wikipedia's mobile site, which sort of collapses each subsection behind an accordion. And then on large screens, whenever there's enough space to comfortably to expose that content, we could go ahead and do that, right? So this is nice. It's sort of a best of both worlds. And this general practice has been a long-standing usability principle called progressive disclosure, right? Where you sort of tuck away sort of the not so important bits, but keep them accessible behind some sort of trigger, right? This is a sort of a very novel pattern, a very recent one too, where on small screens you sort of have tabs, but then it sort of blows out into these sort of three distinct columns on larger screens. This is a really cool pattern simply because it keeps the vertical screen space the same, right? So it's not like you're stacking those three blocks on top of each other and making this long scrolling thing. Instead, you have these nice little tabs. I think that's really, really clever. Okay, and to finish up, we'll talk quickly about forms. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk through a redesign we did of this food bank website back in the US in my home city. And the whole reason we got in touch with this client is because we wanted to donate to their organization. They help feed hungry people in our city. We wanted to contribute to that. We wanted to give them some money to help with their cause. And whenever I went to their donate page, this is what I saw. I'm like, how do I give you money? Right? So, and eventually, like 3 paragraphs in, you get, and there's actually like a form or whatever, but it was buried. And I'm like, well, that's a shame, because, here's a good organization doing really important work, and, they should have a better donate experience. So we got in touch with them and we said, hey, how would you like a new website? And they said, sure. And so we were able to design them a new website. So this is what the donate experience looks like now. And I'm going to walk through some of the things that we were considering to make this effective donate form, okay? First and foremost, we wanted to be visible. Again, instead of being buried, we wanted to make sure that on every page above the footer, right, the user would be able to donate to the food bank, right? So the whole idea is that people are on the site, they're reading content, hopefully they get inspired, and then they see the donate form, and it's like, oh, hey, I could contribute to the cause, yeah? Cut out the noise. This is something that we borrowed, from Amazon and lots of other e-commerce experiences. Whenever, Amazon is notoriously this very loud, very complex, lots of stuff going on. As soon as you get into the checkout flow, all of that goes away. And you're left with the sole task of checking out, right? So that's what we're doing on this donate page. We kill the top navigation, we kill the footer, we kill every other piece of content or non-core content, and keep the user focused on the task at hand, which is to donate money, right? We don't want to distract them. We want to break big tasks into smaller steps. What ends up happening, especially on mobile, whenever you present users with like a form that's like 15 fields long, users go, nope, nope, I have better things to do with my time. I don't have time to fill out this gigantic form. So one of the big things that we could do is break big tasks into smaller ones. So what we're doing on the donate form is we're saying, hey, how much would you like to donate? We're asking a single question to them. How much would you like to donate? And then they make a decision. Once they make that decision, then we go, cool. we just need some information from you, just your name and your email address or whatever. And then we say, okay, the last step, which is, give us your credit card information to actually process the payment, right? So we're sort of taking them through this nice little step-by-step, one at a time flow, rather than hitting them over the head with this gigantic form. Use button styling for input. We talked about the importance of touch, right? And instead of these teeny tiny little radio buttons, we actually borrowed this from Barack Obama's campaign website. In the US, we raise money like crazy, we're constantly begging, politicians are begging us for money all the time. It was very, very annoying. But anyways, so Obama's site had these sort of nice chunky button style inputs to decide how much you want to donate to his campaign. So we followed sort of a similar path, where instead of having little radio buttons, we have these nice finger-friendly, touch-friendly, chunky buttons, yeah? Smart defaults. Not many people know what's an appropriate amount to donate to a food bank like this or to a nonprofit or whatever. So we're sort of we're selecting one value by default. We're basically saying, hey, maybe $50 is an appropriate initial value. And of course, the user can decide to do something else, but we're sort of just picking an option for them, yeah? Articulate impact. This is sort of a cool one, and I would have liked to spend more time on this. But basically what we're doing is we're saying whenever the user sort of selects one of these things, it updates the label with what that money can do, right? And that sort of helps create this connection and hopefully encourages people to donate more. It's like, hey, if you donate this much money, this many people can be fed for this long. Inline validation. We were using a JavaScript library called Parsley.js, if anybody's used that in here. It's a really fantastic little library that basically lets you, it lets users know whenever they exit a field if that field was valid or not, right? It's like, is this helpful, yes or no, right? Did you fill out your email address correctly? It lets them know, because there's nothing worse than filling out this gigantic form, and then you hit the submit button, and then the browser says, you did something wrong. And then it's like, go fish, go find it, right? And then you have to scroll up, and it's like, oh, I didn't fill this out right, or whatever. So it's really good to sort of let the users know that right after they exit the field. Reduce taps, right? The less input the user has to do, the better, right? Especially on mobile. Forms suck, right? Filling out forms suck. It is not fun, right? So the more you can do to take away steps, the more you can do to remove friction from the users, the more likely it is they'll actually fill it out. So one of the cool things that you can do is use the proper input types. HTML5 now has these new input types that allow us to pull up the correct virtual keyboard on our phones. So if you're looking for a numeric value, like a postal code, right, that's only numbers, how about instead of pulling up or doing input type text, we could instead do input type number and have this extra pattern attribute on here, and that will pull up the big, chunky telephone keyboard prompt. Now suddenly, that's one less tap that the user has to do to fill out the thing, and it also creates this much better user experience. And the same thing goes with lots of other form types as well. There's things, you could do input type email, and that will surface the little @ and a little .com. You could do input type HTTP, which will bring up input type URL, which will bring up HTTP and .com and stuff like that. You do input type date, time, color. There's a bunch of different ones out there. Definitely be using those. This is an interesting one. Automatically generate city and state information. I'm not sure how this would work in your specific area, but one convention that normally happens in the US at least is that we say city, state, and then our zip code. Okay? I don't know how that works here or with the country you're from, but the thing is that if we sort of shift the order of that, so in our case, what we're doing is we're asking for the postal code first. And what we're doing is we're hitting a little API that will then go out and find what that postal code maps to, and then pre-populate the city and state information. So that's 2 entire fields the user no longer has to fill out. And of course, if it gets it wrong, they could go in and edit it, but that's the beauty that we have here, right? And then the last one is using the single credit card information input pattern. This is a really fascinating pattern that was used by Square, which is the like sort of mobile sort of credit card thing. It's been ported to the web. Unfortunately, we had to pull this out just because it wasn't exactly done and dusted yet. But at the same time, what it does is it takes that credit card input, which is typically like 3 or 4 fields, and actually combines it into this one sort of Uber field, right? That keeps the user in their place. It's actually really fascinating, and some early user testing has showed that people actually prefer this pattern. The last thing I'll talk about is this notion of the float label pattern. What the float label pattern is this notion of sort of inlining labels into form inputs can be effective. It saves vertical screen real estate and turns things into sort of like, turns inputs into buttons, but at the same time, it's not very accessible, because once you fill out those form fields, you lose the context of what that form was. And that's especially important when it comes to like the browser auto-completing a form or using things like 1Password to generate sort of information. So this float label pattern sort of gives us the best of both worlds. And it's pretty good looking too, right? So you have this like cool little thing where once you start typing, right? Once you start filling in the field, the sort of label floats up above the input, right? So it's like this really nice, elegant pattern that lets us sort of take advantage of that sort of more button style input, but then also pull up the label. Okay. How you all doing? You good? All right. So this is hard. This stuff is tremendously difficult, right? And again, nobody has this stuff figured out. We're all just trying to figure out, how these patterns work, what works best, what performs best, and it's a process, right? Nobody has all the answers, right? This is hard. This is not easy, right? But it's absolutely necessary, right? Not just for the strength of your own individual businesses or clients or whatever, but really the strength of the web, right? We now need the web to go more places than ever before. Smartphones, dumb phones, netbooks, notebooks, watches, whatever, right? And this is only going to accelerate. We're sending our web experiences to more places than ever. And again, I mentioned this yesterday, but I think that these are fantastic, really, really fun problems to solve. So thanks for hanging in. And again, you'll get these slides. And seriously, thanks so much for listening. Thank you.